Now we had to capture the colony of Sisha. The enemy had adapted the brick houses, barns, stone bases of the fences of the village as a resistance node, the front edge of which stretched in a winding line, bypassing the eastern outskirts of Gurno, the slopes of height 177.9 and Dorotka. Our attacks have not yet brought the desired success. The fascists held firm, now and then counter-attacked with the support of artillery and self-propelled guns. No less fierce battles were fought and neighbours. The 862nd Rifle Regiment continued to attack Dorotka with its left flank, and the right flank, the height of 177.9. The 828th Rifle Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel Krasovsky attacked the enemy in the direction of Gurn. Many soldiers, sergeants and officers of the division distinguished themselves in these battles. Bravely fought Lieutenants I. Rodionov P. Sherpa, Petty Officers V. Merzen T. Ivanova, Sergeants N. Shalamov, Chinko Yunor Veldin, K. Yasenamayanov, AAA Kazakov, I. Elkin Private V. Yerezanov, and others. Gradually new units began to arrive at the bridgehead. The Corps Command decided to narrow the front of the division offensive. The 862nd Rifle Regiment of Major Vasily Kozevnikov, who surrendered the battle area in the Dorotka area to the units of the 273rd Rifle Division of Colonel S. Lototsky, focused the main efforts on the mastery of height 177.9, displacing the battalions of our regiment. On the right flank of the 828th Rifle Regiment of Lieutenant Nikolai Krasovsky also came out division of the second echelon of the Corps. Flamethrowers arrived. Measures were taken to increase combat effectiveness. In regiments and battalions in the division de regiments, reinforcement of rifle units went at the expense of the rear. Riders, cooks, armourers, medics got into combat formation. The command decided to disband the 3rd battalions of the regiments and to transfer the released personnel to the 1st and 2nd battalions. However, even this was not enough. The human losses were too great. We began to come to us artillerymen, signallers. August 7, a team of sappers arrived for replenishment. I had great respect for these war workers. It happened, while you are secured in the captured from the enemy trenches and passages of communication, they will already set mines on the tank dangerous directions, and anti-personnel mines will provide the flanks. Sappers accompanied us in the offensive, prepared passages in the enemy's engineering barriers, and how much they had to bear while demining bridges, roads, column tracks, setting up various kinds of crossings. I remember Senior Sergeants Shagaimatov, Sergachev, Petty Officer Merzen, Sergeant Skuba, Biryukov. They were real masters of their craft. I often had to meet with the battalion commander Major Konstantin Lapshin, a calm, poised officer, always busy to the limit. He, however, did not lose his sense of humour and good mood. His deputy Major Boris Georgievich Zvebaydin was a man emotional, fast. During the forcing of the Vistula, under enemy fire, he never left the crossing for a minute. His orderliness instilled confidence in people. It is not by chance that Boris Georgievich was awarded for forcing the Vistula with the following words. Brave, resourceful. During the construction of ferry and landing crossings, he showed courage and bravery. Provided delivery of 80 tons of ammunition and food to the bridgehead. Major Zvezdin, for this glorious battle, was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. I knew well and company commanders of the Sapper Battalion, Captain Dmitry Rapsov, brave, courageous officer, for the successful performance of tasks of the command to defeat the Nazi invaders, even before forcing the Vistula, received the Order of the Red Star and Patriotic War II degree. Captain Anatoly Livadnev was an experienced, mature commander. The whole division knew the name of the commander of the Sapper platoon, Lieutenant Vladimir Mosin. The brave sapper fought on the Leningrad front, and after being wounded he came to us. From the first days of his stay in the division, and especially in the January and February battles, he drew attention to himself by his knowledge, skill, resourcefulness. He was awarded several medals, the Order of the Red Star, for ensuring the forcing of the Vistula, and the courage and heroism shown in this case was presented to a high government award. I was familiar with other officers, many soldiers and sergeants of the Engineer Battalion. I knew how proud they were of their military team and loved it. Well, understanding the condition of those who arrived and wanting to somehow cheer them up, I talked to them, told them about the situation on the bridgehead and promised, as soon as the replenishment arrives, to send them to their unit. We understand, Comrade Captain. A sergeant with 2 patches for heavy wounds answered for everyone. This measure is forced. We will fight on our conscience. We distributed the sappers by companies. In the course of further fighting, they showed themselves with the best side, went together with everyone in the attacks, secured the territory captured from the enemy. Here, as they say, they were in their elements. They adapted the enemy's engineering structures to the needs of platoons and companies, equipped trenches, cells, firing positions, together with infantrymen helped to equip the artillerymen. Once during the night, together with the gunners equipped a false firing position of the battery, which the enemy hammered with artillery and heavy mortars, until he realized that he was held, and in retaliation for a good half an hour mowed down the battalion's defence. Many sappers for the battles on the bridgehead I presented to government awards. Meanwhile, the fierceness of the fighting not only did not weaken, but seemed to increase day by day. The enemy continued to resist, pulled up reserves, undertook counterattacks, trying to push us off the bridgehead or at least push us back. Only on the night of August 7, we repelled 14 neighbours on the left, 6, and on the right, 4 counterattacks of the enemy. Over the bridgehead was an incessant rumble. Around-the-clock fired artillery from early morning until late evening hovered airplanes of the other side. It was necessary to endure all this, to continue to fulfill the task of expanding the bridgehead. One day the 862nd Rifle Regiment, with the assistance of our 1st Battalion, after a heavy hours-long battle finally captured the height of 177.9. However, it was not possible to gain a foothold on it from the first time. After several enemy attacks, the regiment was forced to withdraw, having completely exhausted its ammunition, taking with it wounded comrades. On this day, one of the best officers of the 862nd Rifle Regiment, the commander of the machine gun company Vasily Dmitriev, died a brave death on the battlefield. Machine gunners stood to the last. They ran out of ammunition, fought off the invading Germans with trophy weapons, grenades fought in hand-to-hand battles, and only by order, having broken through the ring of encirclement, they withdrew. I understood the state of combatants Dmitry Shorin and Gennady Makurin. To take and give back to the enemy a height, here it is not to good mode. I called Captain Makurin and expressed my regret about what had happened. We were pushed from the heights, my side Gennady Makarovich. We piled on, beat them, and they were climbing, cockroach brat. Makurin was silent for a while, but nothing. They say that debt is red with payment. I think the Krauts won't have long to rejoice, neighbour. Soon you'll hear our Sabantui. Indeed, in the first half of the night, the artillery opened fire on the enemy at 177.9. Even the batteries of Captains Ivan Makarenko, Ivan Kislev, and Ivan Boldenko supporting us dropped their ammunition. From the NP, it was clearly visible how the ground was smoking and burning, or rather, what could still burn. That's what they give the thrushes. Lieutenant Nikolai Boyko, the commander of the reconnaissance platoon of the artillery regiment, who was with us to adjust the fire, couldn't stand it. The Germans have to take it hard. Oh, how hard. And getting into excitement, he shouted, "Take them, guys. Beat them, crush." Boyko, Presnyakov turned to him. "Hold your emotions." "My fault, comrade captain, but I've got a lot of anger against the Krauts. Frankly speaking, no less delighted with the fire of our artillery caused all of us. The last raid on the enemy defences was particularly strong. It was attended by artillerymen of the 273rd Rifle Division. The height, the adjacent terrain along the front, and in depth were covered with a sea of fire. There was a continuous howling and rumbling. No sooner had the last artillery salvos fallen silent, the sky began to draw rockets. The 862nd Rifle Regiment went to storm the height. At a general signal on the enemy and their sectors opened fire on duty machine guns, mortar batteries of our and neighbouring regiments. From the edge into the edge of the bridgehead came to life, lit up with a scattering of rockets, flashes of shots, bursts of shells and mines. Under the rumble of cannonade battalions, Shorin and Makurin attacked the enemy. During the assault, especially distinguished commander of the 4th Rifle Company, Lieutenant Sergei Zadarin. Under his leadership, the soldiers bypassed the height and flanked the enemy. A hand-to-hand fight ensued. Soldiers fought fiercely. In the afternoon, the company lost more than a third of its personnel. In front of the retreating soldiers, Hitlerites abused the fallen in battle Komsomol machine gunners, who could not be taken out. They stabbed the guys with bayonets, shot at them. Then they hanged them on barbed wire. And then came the retribution. Blood for blood, death for death. Lieutenant Zadorin was the first to break into the western slopes of the heights. Without stopping, led the fighters further. He showed a lot of initiative and resourcefulness in the future. For the battles on the bridgehead, Sergei Mikhailovich Zadorin was awarded the Order of High Government awards were also awarded to his subordinates. At 4 o'clock in the morning, battalions of Major Kozhevnikov broke into the first trench of the enemy and pushed him. The fascists, holding some parts of the trench and communication lines, continued to resist fiercely. Neither side dared to use artillery for fear of hitting their own. True, the Germans tried to help the garrison of the height through the colony of Sisha, but the maneuver was spotted in time by the observers of our regiment, caught under flank rifle and machine gun fire. Over a company of the enemy lay down in a small hollow. Further Hitlerites were almost completely destroyed by mortars of Lieutenant Vasily Ponomarev. By dawn, the height was cleared of the enemy. Shooting somewhat subsided. It was felt that Hitlerites were exhausted. But for how long? From behind the blackening on the horizon forest massive crawled grey, gloomy clouds. They tightly covered the sky. It became gloomy. The wind blew, sweeping away ashes from the steep-headed hillocks, lifted black whirlwinds into the air and swirled them, carrying them toward the Vistula. The rain poured down strong, direct, not subject to the currents of air, and soldiers and commanders, having thrown off their helmets and taken off their uniforms, ran out of the trenches and trenches, exposing their sweaty shoulders and dishevelled hair to the streams of water, quacking with pleasure. "I wish we had a bathhouse here." The Captain Bukharin shrugged his shoulders, looking at how the communications and supply platoon soldiers were happily patting themselves on their bare sides. The body was already tired of water, especially hot water. "Why? It's not a bad idea." Lieutenant Yeligin picked up Nikolai Yakovlevich's thought. "It's high time we thought about washing people. It's not difficult to organize it in the rear. But here? What's your opinion, Commander?" But then Captain Presniakov joined the conversation. "The Germans will organize you a bath with a steam bath. Dreamers." "Why? Dreamers, Igor Tarasovich." I objected to Presniakov. "Life demands it. Even in such conditions we have to think about the bath and about the whole front life. This is our duty." We began to look for materials for the construction of the bathhouse. On the bridgehead we lived not only battles. In the battalion held party and komsomol meetings, conversations, issued combat leaflets. Ivan Ivanovich Yeligin, together with the secretary of the komsomol organization, on the second day of forcing organized the release of leaflets about the distinguished soldiers, sergeants and officers. Not only in the regiment, but also in the whole division became known about the feat of the 1st Paratroopers Lieutenant Alexander Chikishev, Sergeant Alexander Zatnoye, Privates Vladimir Ovsyannikov, Vasily Praisov, Junior Sergeants Alexei Vereshchuk, Ivan Lunov. By our example, leaflet zippers about the heroes of the battles on the bridgehead began to be issued in other regiments and battalions. Admission to the party did not stop. After attacks, artillery raids, repulsion of enemy counterattacks, communists gathered in trenches still emanating the sour smell of TNT craters, sorted out the applications of soldiers, sergeants and officers with a request to accept them into the ranks of the Leninist party. The best recommendation was the behavior of a comrade in battle, where the most vividly manifested the character of the man, his devotion to the people, the cause of the great Lenin. Secretary of the Party Bureau of the regiment, Major Yurkov, on this occasion said, "It's okay if a person in theory is still not strong enough. It can be corrected. We will help, just as long as he was with us in heart." Sergei Dmitrievich Yurkov was highly respected in the regiment. He was a brave, determined, experienced political officer. In critical moments, he became a chain or led the reflection of enemy counterattacks. "We will be alive, we will not die," Sergei Dmitrievich liked to repeat. "For us, the bullet is not yet cast." He could often be seen in platoons and companies. Stocky but slender, blonde-haired, with a soft smile, he brought to the rifle cells, to the firing positions, warmth and cordiality, which was sometimes so lacking for the soldiers on the front line. He was able to create a relaxed atmosphere in combat. One will cheer up with a word, the second will help to write a letter home, the third will give advice, prompts how to act. Not without reason, fighters opened to him the innermost things. Among themselves they called Yurkov our party secretary, putting in these words their love and respect for him. I don't remember, after the German attack near Sisha, when people were dead tired and indifference began to take over, he appeared in the battalion's fighting order with the news that the 828th, 862nd Rifle, and artillery regiments were named Vladimir Volinsky. There was no opportunity to gather the personnel on this occasion. The enemy was firing. We held a delegate meeting, wrote a zipper leaflet, which went through the soldiers' hands. The sole forces of the fighters were restored. Do not spare time to work with people, as Piaget reminded us. They are our strength. This time will more than pay off in battle, when a man will be required to exert maximum tension. During one of the artillery raids, Major Yurkov was seriously wounded. Sergei Dmitrovich Yurkov, a man of great will, a communist, remained in my memory cheerful and simple. I cannot help but remember the agitator of the regiment, Major Vokmintsev. He could often be seen in the circle of soldiers, sergeants and officers. He brought the Sovinform Bureau reports to the people, told about the situation on other fronts and in the rear. Every word of Anatoly Ivanovich hit the target, caused anger and indignation in the hearts of the soldiers, made us forget about fatigue, difficulties of daily fights. Continuing to fulfill the task of expanding the bridgehead, by the 10th of August, the regiment approached the colony of Sisha. One night at the battalion's NP appeared Major Pavlyuk. The regiment commander was very concerned about something. Let's go to the companies. Combat, Valentin Yevstafyevich suggested to me. We threw on over our gymnasium coats, took our automatic rifles and, accompanied by the orderlies, moved to the front line. The night was not particularly restless. From the evening, the fascists tried to attack the 6th Rifle Company, but withdrew, leaving 12 corpses of soldiers and officers on the battlefield. Closer to midnight, they calmed down. Only from time to time the duty machine guns clattered and the signalers coloured the terrain with rockets. The moon crawled out from behind the horizon. Climbing higher and higher, it continued its leisurely movement across the August sky, barely dulled by smoky blue. The cool breeze carried with it vague rustles, echoes of the past battle. In the northeast, the sky glinted with sparks. An alarming summer night floated over the front line. The Krauts are silent. Major Pavlyuk stopped in the bend of the message passage. They had worked hard during the day, and in the evening they tried their luck. How did it go? It didn't work out. We withdrew with losses. Now they've calmed down. We're looking in the direction of Tisais. Sometimes it seems that someone is moving there from house to house and our eyes involuntarily tense up. But no matter how much we look, we can't see anything. Probably from the battalion headquarters about us reported to the company commanders. In the trench, barely noticeable to the experienced eye movement. From the sleeve of the passage of communication appear human figures. In front of the acting company commander, Senior Lieutenant Serpukin. The regiment commander greets him, interested in business. Normal, answers Pyotr Fedorovich, except that the Germans began to behave restlessly. They are shamelessly probing the defense, conducting reconnaissance. Yesterday they almost took away the machine gunner on duty. That's all we need. Well, Comrade Major, they didn't. The newcomer from the riding team, tired during the day, a little relaxed, but at the last moment raised the alarm. The enemy reconnaissance team was cleaned out at the very trench. I see. See? The regiment commander turned to me and nodded in the direction of the NFE. Are you conducting reconnaissance? Yes, by observation, eavesdropping. Yesterday, Chalaganidze examined the ravine approaching Tishitsi. The Germans haven't minded yet. Where is it? Not far here, on the right flank of the 4th Company. Let's go there, Alexander Terentievich. By the way, Major Pavlyuk became animated, and with what interest he said the last words. It was not difficult to guess what the regimental commander had come to us for. Valentin Yevstafyevich was interested in Sisha, for the possession of which we have been fighting for several days in a row. This worried not only us, but also the headquarters of the regiment, division, and the corps. Calls from different instances, telephone conversations are a convincing evidence of it. Now the regimental commander arrived at the front line. Arrived, as they say, not from a good life. The situation forced to look for approaches to Sisha. The 4th Company occupied the defence on the slopes of a low curved hill. The commander's NP was nestled between overgrown briar bushes, just below the ridge, to which led shallow whiskers of communication passages. Senior Lieutenant Odov met us at the approach and asked us to be careful. Sometimes the Germans are pranking. They have taken aim. Now, how is the enemy behaving? Major Pavlyuk nodded towards the Germans. During the day does not let us raise our heads. At night it calms down. he answered Dmitry Mikhailovich. He buries himself in the ground. Platoon commanders report. They hear the clatter of shovels. So they are entrenching. Yes, they're preparing a defense. Last night they tried to lay mines. We interfered. They made such a mess that the Krauts threw the prepared holes and— Wait, Odegov. Pavlyuk stopped him. Where is the hollow that Chalaganidze reported? Nearby, behind those 2 trees, it begins. That's where Chalaganidze is holding the defense. For some reason the Germans leave the hollow open, although it comes right up to the Sishets yards. So they leave it open, Dubby involuntarily burst out. What if today or tomorrow they intercept it with— That's right, Comrade Captain, they'll intercept it. Chalaganidze reports. The Krauts are suspiciously fussing in the gardens. Are they preparing something there? We went to the defense of Senior Lieutenant Chalaganidze's platoon. Emmanuel Nestorovich, a handsome, stately Georgian, greeted us cordially, reported on the defense, the enemy's behavior, and, already finishing, drew our attention to the fact that the fascists were mining the gardens, which were the last approach to Sisha. But so far the minefields are not everywhere. You say not everywhere, Pavlyuk clarified. That's right, Comrade Major. The guys have found a couple of passages. So you can, Genetsvale? You can lead the men through? Of course I can. We must hurry. Major Pavlyuk looked at his watch and continued thoughtfully. We still need to check, Altunin. I'll send scouts, take another look at the passages, think how to use them better. Then report your thoughts. There shouldn't be any misfires. You'll soon receive a combat order. The regiment commander did not introduce us to the details of the upcoming case. Perhaps he had not yet made a final decision, but no one had any doubts that it was to come. We went back the same way. One of our companions caught his foot on an empty tin can. It rolled and rattled on the rocks. We froze in place. From the side of the enemy hit a line, followed by a second, a third. Rockets illuminated the area. Bullets clattered around us, squealing. Get down, Valentin Yevstafevich commanded. No sooner had we fallen to the ground than there came a shrill rustling from above. Tara, fuck. Explosions rumbled in the darkness around us. Shrapnel squealed. Clods of earth drummed on our back. The mines continued to burst. For a moment the flames catch our faces out of the darkness, blinding us. We're in trouble, a thought flashed through my mind. The regiment commander will be caught by accident. Todley trouble will not be no trouble. The ground shakes. The walls of a shallow trench crumble, shrapnel whistles. But now the mortar fire began to subside. From small arms the enemy continues to shoot. Large caliber machine guns are giving voice. We have disturbed the Krauts, says Valentin Evetafevich. The devils are furious. By the way, the Germans have large caliber machine guns in your sector. I've never heard of them before. Did they pull them up at dusk? Apparently. Did your observers miss it? I didn't say anything. Pavlyuk waited for a pause, then continued. In addition, the Germans have a lot of handheld machine guns. You are supported by a fighter anti-tank battery. What does it do? Do you task the anti-tankers or do they want armoured targets? Yes, I do. We destroyed 4 firing points during the day, and there were armoured targets. So tell them from me. In the attack, clear the way for the companies. Not only large caliber machine guns, but also light machine guns. Otherwise they'll go in chains with your men. Tell them so. I involuntarily remembered last night. I lay down to rest already in the morning, but sleep did not come. An unexplainable feeling of uneasiness seized me and did not let me forget. After turning around for half an hour on the hard improvised bed, I got up and went out of the trench. The orderly appeared next to me. Wake up the machine gunners. I'll go to the companies, and you lie down to rest. Tomorrow will be a hard day. They're all hard, Comrade Captain. You should get some sleep too. No. Did you hear what I told you? 5 minutes later, accompanied by machine gunners, I went to the front line. On the way I looked at the firing position of a battery of anti-tank guns. A sentry called us and demanded to tell us the password. We came closer. The guns were well covered in trenches. Ammunition was lying in ditches. Right by the stand-ins, the crews had forgotten a short sleep. They had worked hard, Comrade Captain, during the day. He explained to me the sergeant who came up. And just in case— I see. Shall I wake up the commander? No need. You have 2 platoons here. The 3rd is on the hill. Yes, comrade captain. Next to the post of your 4th Company commander. All right, let's go there. A sergeant volunteered to escort us. Near the Germans' scattered mines, comrade captain. Mabbe captain, he warned. The sappers haven't had time to remove them yet. True, they marked them with pointers, but who knows, you might stumble by accident. It's all the same to me. Time to check the service. And I know every bush. All right, lead the way. I agreed. In 150 meters we were there. We went to the guns. While the sergeant was talking to the sentry, I listened. Nothing suspicious was heard. Not far away there was a black bend in the trench, and we went there, but before we had gone a few steps we were stopped by a muffled shout. I called the password again. No. Comrade Captain, are you? Aye. Here. I'll wake up the platoon commander. He's right here. Don't, Zerev, said something in Replenishment. Did you recognize me? Neferenti, how can I not remember you? Ivan Petrovich. I first met Private Zverev, a short-talking collective farmer from Chernigov region, before forcing the Vistula. At one of the breaks they were distributing the replenishment that had arrived from the march. They wanted to assign him to the riding company because of his age. He flatly refused. I need to be in the ranks, comrades commanders. Me, said the fighter. I have a special account to the fascists. So, our village was plundered completely by the monsters and then burned. They sent Zverev to a rifle company, and they weren't mistaken. In the first battles he showed himself with a positive side. Simple, calm, Ivan Petrovich favourably influenced the youth of the platoon, and it was not by chance that it was his commander appointed him to carry out the service at this difficult time of the day. Together we went around the defence of the platoon. Trench, cells, firing positions for machine guns and anti-tank guns, everything was done well, on conscience. The machine gunners on duty were awake. When asked how the enemy was behaving, they replied, normally. You guys, still look around the corner of the garden, advised them Zerev. Not just in an hour and will come Hitleritz. Having parted with Private Zverev, I went with machine gunners along the trench towards the neighbouring platoon. I was glad here too. People were serving correctly. I looked into the 5th Company. Senior Lieutenant Kovalev was awake. I sat down with him to smoke. Even Archipovich complained about the lack of men. They promised to replenish them, but they didn't send them. I wish we had officers, comrade captain. Platoons are commanded by sergeants. I know, Ivan Archipovich, I know. But what can you do? We'll have to take Sisha with our own forces. And I see, sighed Kovalev. I will prepare people. In front of the 6th Company, the enemy also behaved calmly. However, the feeling of anxiety did not pass. Going back, involuntarily delayed a step. From the direction of Sisha came some incomprehensible rumbling. I lay down on the ground and looked closely. In a few minutes, a black vague shadow appeared, which soon formed the contours of a tank. Following it arose a second vehicle, then a third. The column at a muted speed went along the front. I rushed to the firing position of artillerymen. The crew of the gun that had moved forward was still asleep. I pushed the guys up. The commander of the gun himself stood behind sight, deftly clanked the bolt. A shot. One could see how the shell tracer entered the side of the lead car. The numbers of the crew of the 40-50 had not yet had time to reload the gun, as a sheaf of fire flashed over the German tank. On the second, come on, shouted one of the gunners. The gun rolled back again. A shell with a fiery arc brushed the armour. Oh, it doesn't take, spit the sergeant. Pointed to the side. It's too late. The Nazi tanks were turning around, going to the rear. Artillerymen, now the whole battery, were firing at the enemy. They managed to set fire to one more enemy vehicle. The crews, who left the tanks, fell under our machine guns. The firing duel continued until the German tanks hid in the gardens of Sisha. The fascists were the first to stop firing. After them, our artillerymen also quieted down. Only 2 pillars of fire reminded of the past heavy stench, till the late morning lay over the ground. During the day, the fighter anti-tank battery destroyed 4 enemy firing points, so my praise of the battery was well deserved. However, Valentin Yevstofievich replied with a note of irony in his voice. You pity the gunners, Commander. Look how it would not be worse. You have to lift the men to the attack. I will, Comrade Major. It's not the first time, and Masterov will clear the way. Good then. Major Pavliuk shook my hand. I'll take a look at the 1st Battalion. Get ready for the attack. Don't forget about the passages. You'll need them very much. The regiment commander left. When I got back to the regiment, I woke up Captain Presniakov. Bukharin woke up too. We went to work. Set the task mortars, anti-tankers, a platoon of 40-footers, or rather one remaining gun with an incomplete calculation. At the NP arrived commander of the fighter anti-tank battery, Captain Masterov. Just sat down with him to think about how best to use his artillerymen. A messenger arrived from the regimental headquarters with a combat order to attack. I turned to the telephonist. Company commanders and individual units, here. There was not much time left before the attack. There was a lot to do to combat order, to give the opportunity to work lower commanders to feed people. There was a lot of other unforeseen things. In short, no matter how much we were in a hurry, we barely had time to cope with the artillery preparation. According to the general plan, we were to storm the Sisha colony from the front. The 1st Battalion, with 2 companies, struck at the enemy defences on the left flank, and 1 company cut the road to the settlement from the northwest. At 5:30, the Pasha's artillery struck. The front was covered with fountains of bursts. For 15 minutes, divisions of the Art Regiment processed Hitlerite positions. Fighter anti-tank battery was firing on reconnaissance targets. The Art Brigade assigned to the division shelled the positions of artillery and mortar batteries of the enemy, but now our cannoneers transferred their fire to Sisha. At my signal, rockets flew up. The companies went on the attack. Taking advantage of the passages, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Odegov broke into the first enemy trench with relative ease. It was more difficult for the 5th and 6th companies. The units came under dagger machine gun fire, lay down and began to suffer casualties. We had to urgently target their artillerymen of Captain Masterov. From their reserve positions, they opened fire on the enemy machine gun nests, and in just a few minutes cleared the way for the gunners. The companies broke into the German trench, and, having rolled over it, rushed to the Sisha houses, where the platoons of Senior Lieutenant Odevod had already engaged in battle. Dmitry Mikhailovich Odegov took the company during the operation to force the Vistula. From the first hours of the battle on the bridgehead, found himself in a new position. The subordinates saw in him a strong-willed, fearless commander and believed in him. In this case, the commander was greatly assisted by the platoon commander, as well as the company's party leader, Senior Lieutenant Emmanuel Shalaganides. Calm Odegov and hot Shalaganides as if complemented each other, which positively affected the performance of combat tasks. In short, for the 4th Company I was always calm, fights assertively and calculating. I was not mistaken in it, and now possessed 4 farmsteads, reported through a contact Dmitry Mikhailovich. But the enemy resistance is increasing. The advance is hindered by 2 dug-in tanks. While Captain Masterov transferred there a platoon of anti-tank guns, the soldiers managed to destroy one of the machines. The anti-tank gun crew distinguished themselves. Private Ivan Gudimenko, the gunner, hit the triplex with the second shot and blast them. The rest was done by anti-tank grenades. The fascist vehicle burst into flames and exploded to the friendly horror of the infantrymen who rushed forward. So the company of Senior Lieutenant Odegov, diverting the attention of the enemy, gave the 1st Battalion the opportunity to bypass Sisha from the left flank and intercept the road from the village Dorotka, on which the fascists were bringing reinforcements to the village. Battalions of the 828th Vladimir Volinsky Regiment were flanking the colony on the right. Desperately resisting Germans first scattered, then began to stagger back, coming under rifle and machine gun fire of companies of our 1st Battalion. The enemy tried to bring to the battle site reserves from the west, but these reserves, up to a battalion of the enemy supported by assault guns, were forced to turn around and engage the company of Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Timofeev. Here, the machine gunners of Captain Alexei Besanov, who supported the unit, especially distinguished themselves. They literally pinned the German infantry to the ground and did not let them raise even their heads until the end of the battle. The 862nd Vladimir Volinsky Regiment finally deprived the Germans of the opportunity to bring forces and means to the aid of the Sisha garrison. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the battle, having gained strength, was rattling all over the bridgehead. The fascists concentrated on our fighting orders all the power of artillery and mortar and machine gun fire. In the air appeared enemy aviation, but on company and battalion chains Hitlerites, bombing strikes did not dare to strike. The battle orders were mixed up as a result of our incursion into the enemy defense. Nazi pilots dropped a load on the regimental rear and in the area of the division command. By this time, the division headquarters had arrived at the bridgehead, increased efficiency of management, and the influence of the command on the course and outcome of our battles with the Nazis. "Now are things going there?" contacted me in the midst of battle Chief of Staff Colonel Abashev. "Extreme houses Sisha in our hands," I reported to Fyodor Fedorovich. "We are advancing hard. Krauts are clinging to every building. We're taking casualties." "Yes," Fedor Fedorovich coughed. "What can I do for you, Captain? A light? The god of war is here with me." "Not bad, Comrade Colonel. Captain Mastrov's ammunition is running low. That's good. I'll have an officer come to you now to make adjustments. Wait for him, but don't fail to press the Krauts. The colony must be taken." Shivs hung up the phone. Almost immediately, Major Paveryuk called. The regiment commander was also dissatisfied with the slow advance. "We're losing time, Altunin. Krauts every minute increase the pressure on Krasovsky and Kozhevnikov, not to mention the 1st Battalion. Hurry up. I'll subordinate Sergeyev and whatever else I can scrape together. I'm waiting for good news." 15 minutes later, at the battalion's NP appeared the commander of the artillery division, Major Bereza, and from the course of the message bar. "Well, what are you here, vagabond stuck? What kind of help do you need, Commander?" "Ordinary, more fire, Valentin Petrovich. The Krauts have pinned down the companies with machine gun fire, and their artillery won't let us raise our heads." "Well, we can do it. Show me where the Germans are and where your companies are." While I was introducing Valentin Petrovich to the situation, the commander of the company of machine gunners, Captain Sergeyev, appeared. Together with him, I had to solve problems before. Ivan Alexeyevich was repeatedly awarded for his combat deeds. From today, he was to be promoted, but because of the situation, the regiment command decided to leave him in his former position until the end of the battle. I knew about the appointment and, extending my hand, could not resist. In the last decisive battle, Ivan Alexeyevich. It's how to say it. As a company officer, perhaps, but in general, where can a commander walk away from a battle? Sergeyev stretched out to his full height, smiled good-naturedly. "Set the task, Alexander Terentievich." "We have one task, to take Tishitsi, Ivan Alexeyevich. Now I see your guys are having a hard time. If you see, there's nothing more to explain. Let's go to Odegov's 4th. I've got him on the main line. You'll figure it out on the spot and then strike after the artillery attack. Sergeant Rebrov escort the captain and his men." Sergeant Sergeyev with Rebrov, a liaison from Odegov, went to the company. A few minutes later, Major Bereza made shooting and moved to defeat. The shells lay down heap, kicking up clouds of brick dust, rubble, logs of buildings. Artillery and mortar regimental batteries and batteries of the fighter anti-tank division also concentrated fire on the enemy. Houses and bread fields adjacent to Sisha were covered with fire and smoke. However, the German artillerymen persisted. Our aviation appeared, and the attacking aircrafts were engaged in processing the enemy's firing positions. There also moved its actions supporting the division artillery brigade. Only after that, the fire from the Germans sharply weakened. Barely had time to hush the last volleys of our artillerymen and mortars, as the companies rose to the attack. From the NP were clearly visible running groups of fighters. The large figure of Captain Sergeyev clearly stood out in the chain of advancing machine gunners. Not far from him, waving his hands with the control group, ran Senior Lieutenant Odegov. A little behind, the machine gun crews were rolling. Splashes of bursts of hand grenades, machine gun bursts, shouts of hurrah, and the units burst into the center of Sisha, began to dissolve in the gardens and front gardens. Now it was difficult to keep track of who was attacking where. Lieutenant Oshev, the commander of the anti-tank rifle platoon, fidgeted nearby. I turned. "No, not hurry. Pyotr Pavlovich and your guys have enough to do." The platoon was in my reserve. I kept it to myself for the time being. There were several reasons for this, but the main one was the small number of calculations. During the previous battles, the platoon had suffered heavy losses in the fight against tanks and self-propelled gunners. I was saving the Peterovsky for the last resort. Meanwhile, the rifle and machine gun fire began to recede. "What, combat?" Turned to me Bereza. "I told you. Let's fix the matter. Let's go, yawn." Thank you, Valentin Petrovich. Let's go." We've combed the crowds, we've worked cleanly. That's right. Know our men. The regiment commander ordered me to accompany you to the end of the battle. Just in case, I've prepared data for firing on the squares behind Sisha. No thanks again. Companies, covering the estates of the settlement, were advancing to its western outskirts, and in the rear of the Hitlerites increased firing. The 1st Battalion continued to fight with the enemy reserve. Germans organized a counterattack from the side of Gurno, but, met by fire of battalions of the 828th Vladimir Volinsky Regiment, were forced to lie down. Although the brunt of the battle to take possession of Sisha fell to the share of our regiment, our neighbours also contributed to the overall success. Planning the battle, the division commander, chief of staff, operators, service chiefs, regiment commander Pavyuk envisioned possible variants of enemy action, provided the regiment with everything necessary for the battle, and in the course of the battle kept, as they say, hand on the pulse, which could not but affect the overall result. At 10 o'clock, Senior Lieutenant Odegov reported that, with the 1st Battalion, he was separated by no more than 150-200 meters. It was the moment of realization of the plan we had outlined, to cut the enemy and destroy him piece by piece. Captain Bukharin was to carry out the plan. So appearing at the battle site, he set Sergeyev's machine gunners the task of destroying the left group without wasting a minute of time after the garrison had been cut into pieces, and Odegov and Asav's platoon to eliminate the right group. The plan succeeded. Half an hour later, as a result of the joint efforts of the 1st and our battalions, Lieutenant Colonel Krasovsky's units Tishetsi were in our hands. Of the entire enemy garrison, only a few managed to escape from the encirclement, but not many surrendered as well. The Germans fought to the last. As I have already mentioned, Goebbels' propaganda, fear of punitive sanctions against relatives and loved ones of those who surrendered. Undoubtedly, the last orders with a categorical warning also played a role here. Retreat from positions is punishable by Hitlerites filled Zashitsi with shells, mines bombarded us, several times counterattacked in one and another place. But encountering persistence, we had to roll back. By evening we were finally exhausted. Of the battle, which lasted several hours, died out in the lowlands near the Vistula. A breeze blew away the stifling stench. For the first time during this hectic day I felt that I should eat and turned to the order. Have we anything to eat, Archipike? At last. Of course we do, Comrade Captain. Both breakfast and lunch are untouched. For the second time I'm heating them up and you still refuse. How can you ask others for not feeding people while you haven't eaten for days and days? Archipike, don't grumble. I stopped my orderly, an elderly, thrifty soldier. Now be quiet, I'll be quiet. The orderly hurried to the niche. Captain Presniakov broke away from the telephone receiver. Chazabitanis reported. Began engineering equipment of the area. Good, Igor Tarasovich. How are we doing with the fire system? We're working. I'm finalizing the fire scheme now. Presniakov knew and liked staff work. He was my good assistant in all official matters. From the first days we established warm, friendly relations, and before making any decision, I always consulted with him. Sometimes I had to change my opinion on this or that, but that didn't stop us from being friends. Why don't we get something to eat? I suggested it. That would be nice. Major Kulyabin caught us at a simple army meal. The battalion commanders are feasting. Nikolai Afanasyevich smiled good-naturedly. We stood up. Sit down. Eat. Perhaps you'd like to join us, Comrade Major. We have breakfast, lunch, and dinner here at once. I guess so. As usual, we've fed the men, but didn't have enough time. It's no good, Comrade Commanders. You're undermining the power of the army. Not good, not good. Presniakov, perplexed, shrugged his shoulders. Major Kulyabin explained. The commander is the head of everything, and the head must be taken care of. And first of all, it is the officer's duty to take care of it. You don't worry about yourself? Nikolai Afanasyevich rolled his eyes and softly continued. Well, that's just for the record. I'd be glad to have a bite to eat with you, and at the same time we'll talk about business. First of all, about Lieutenant Yelagin. Obviously, he won't be back to you for a long time. Yelagin was wounded a week ago during the reflection of one of the fascist counterattacks. He replaced the machine gunner who was out of action. That's where he was hit. It's a pity about Ivan Ivanovich. Without him, it's like without hands. It can't be helped. Kolyabin answered, Yelagin can't be returned yet. Today I talked to the head of the political department. They're picking up your deputy police officer, but Lieutenant Gainin should come not today, tomorrow. Evstafy Kirillovich Gainin arrived to us instead of seriously wounded Lieutenant Vasily Fedorovich Maligan. He had just had time to accept the cases, began to get acquainted with the communists when he was also wounded. So the battalion was left without a deputy on political part and the released secretary of the party organization. He reported about what happened during one of the telephone conversations to the head of the political department. Colonel Peter Grigorievich Zhivago sympathized, promised to help, but in farewell reproach. You need to take care of political workers, Mr. Combat. It's a joke. Almost in one day we're out of service. Not good, even very bad. But they rush to the hottest spots, because they tend to go where it's more difficult. Communists' party duty calls. But the commander could have advised, preempted, finally ordered, and after a pause, with a reproach in his voice, You are silent, you have nothing to answer. And now, listening to the deputy commander of the regiment on the political part, I again experienced in all the details of that conversation. Apparently, Nikolai Afanasyevich, on the changing expression of my face, realized this, transferred the conversation to the events on the Soviet-German front. In these days, the Seversko-Petrozavodskaya offensive operation was successfully completed, as a result of which the Ononets grouping of the enemy was defeated and our troops reached the Soviet-Finnish border. Sovinform Bureau also reports, and continued Kulyabin, B. on the successful actions of the 1st and 2nd Baltic and 1st Belarusian fronts. They do not write about us and do not transmit, B. sighed Captain Presnyakov. Don't tell me, Igor Tarasovich, they report about us too. The day before yesterday, Pravda wrote about the fact that the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front continue offensive battles to expand the bridgehead on the left bank of the Vistula, and that means about you and me. Major Kulyabin took a sip of tea from his mug and inquired about the engineering equipment of the area. I reported the beginning of the work. The deputy commander of the regiment listened attentively and advised. We need to burrow into the ground, and as soon as possible. Apparently, the enemy will continue to be active. Turn Kulyabin and regimental staff was understandable. We knew from the experience of previous battles, the fascists would not leave us alone, they would try to throw us out of Sisha. Our assumptions were justified. In the morning after a short artillery attack, the enemy attacked. The fascist infantry went at full height, which surprised us a lot. Is it possible that reinforcements arrived to the Krauts? Suggested Captain Presnyakov. It doesn't look like it, Igor Tarasovich. I lowered my binoculars. The Germans are behaving unnaturally. I think it's different here. They took a little too much for courage. My hunch was confirmed during the battle. Drunken Germans went to our trenches in full height, not paying attention to the crossfire, mercilessly mowing down their ranks. But they didn't make it. Almost all of them were killed by our trenches, so even the schnapps did not help the fascists. By the middle of August, the fighting gradually began to subside. True, the bridgehead from time to time exploded with the rumble of artillery and mortar cannonade and rifle and machine gun fire, but it was a struggle to improve positions or fire cover for reconnaissance on both sides. In these days, it finally became clear that our bridgehead was auxiliary, and that the main events unfolded to the right and left of us. The main task of expanding the bridgehead on a frontal scale was being solved in the Sandomir area, over our heads from early morning until late evening. Echelons of airplanes of various purposes went there. At night, and especially at dawn, a cohesive rumble came from there. Muffled thunder rumbles were heard. The sky was illuminated with tearing lightning. The command still demanded from us activity against the enemy. It was necessary to restrain possibly more forces and means of Hitlerites. Meanwhile, from the bridgehead slowly began to dwindle units. In the 20th days of August, the division regrouped its forces. The regiment accepted the defence of its neighbour, 862nd Infantry Regiment, which took the positions left by the 273rd Infantry Division. The change was made at nightfall. The enemy did not show much concern, obviously. He did not notice the movement. Our battalion had to settle in the Dorotka area with the adjacent gentle heights. We adapted the engineering structures of our predecessors to our available forces and firepower. In connection with the departure of parts from the bridgehead, the command replenished the thinning ranks of our division, which allowed the regiment to deploy the 3rd Rifle Battalion, led by Captain Bukharin. It was a pity to part with Nikolai Yakovlevich, who knew the front life and never got discouraged. During the joint service, especially the last battles, when the situation required extreme tension, and the line between life and death almost disappeared, we became so close that we began to share with each other the most intimate things. Nikolai Yakovlevich was much older than me. By the 44th Bukharin had passed his 5th decade. He pitied me fatherly, more than once helped me to avoid mistakes. It used to happen. A critical situation would arise. I was going to jump out to the company. He would definitely get ahead of me. I have already, Sisha, lived. I have a son and a daughter on this earth. Stay here, command the battalion, and I'll deal with it there. And, despite my protests, he left, as a rule with his invariable saying, "You are my mother, my havre." Bukharin was a man of no time, always well aware of the situation, found a way out where it was very difficult to find it. I remember, with the transition to Dorotka, it turned out that anti-tank mines are not enough. It was an important issue that could not be delayed. We tried to solve it this way and that. Nothing worked. We were beginning to despair when Nikolai Yakovlevich suggested a simple but effective solution. We put anti-tank mines on the board. At the ends of the board holes were made, a pin was inserted into one of them, by means of which the board was fixed between tank tracks, and in the opposite one ropes were passed through, with the help of which it was possible to easily move the board to the right or to the left. This simple device halved the consumption of mines. In addition, it was controlled by a man, which means that the misses in the defeat of tanks decreased. More than one enemy machine found an ignominious end from Bukharin's invention. According to Russian custom, we sat down to say goodbye. On Nikolai Yakovlevich's gaunt face ran a barely perceptible shadow, but he immediately pulled himself together, smiling. Captain Presniakov came over and handed out mugs with the front 100 grams. We drank to the victory. I'll be there for you. Call me if you need anything, and I won't forget. Bukharin held up my hand to say goodbye. That's how we parted. The battalion continued to improve the defence. In the dark time, fighters plastered the steepness of trenches, cells, firing positions, sappers put mines and engineering barriers, continued to bring ammunition. During the day, dozens of eyes from both sides probed the terrain, looking for elements of the enemy's defence new. It happened that one or another soldier had to hesitate, as he found himself in the crosshairs of a sniper's rifle. Every day, several men from the units continued to refurbish the facilities for economic needs. The commander of the supply platoon, Senior Lieutenant Vasily Zakharov, and Lieutenant of Medical Service, Ivan Rubin, began to build the long-awaited bathhouse. The bathhouse was indeed welcome. In Tvardovsky's wonderful poem, Vasily Turkin, this epic about a soldier of the Great Patriotic War, there is a chapter called "In the." So there is no more precise and better way to say it than then, in a foreign land, my father's home bathhouse. The battles were going on almost continuously, and the weather continued not to pamper us with coolness. The sun generously poured warmth on the ground, so it was hot both literally and figuratively. And if we could create some minimal opportunities for tidying ourselves, also minimal, for the fighters, the washing was worse. In the whirlwind of continuous fights, there was no time to think about it. Only occasionally someone remembered about hot water and birch broom. But now there was relative calm on the line of defence, and soldiers, sergeants and officers, in one voice talked about the bath, to wash off the itchy, irritating to the skin mixture of sweat and dust, to wash hardened gymnases and pants, was the dream of all, and I myself dreamed more and more of having a steam bath. The bathhouse never left my mind. I reminded Reuben about it, and the battalion doctor, as they say, hands and feet, grasped the idea of giving a bath to the personnel. I mentioned it to the chief of staff of the regiment. Major Modin smiled miserably. I understood his smile. This matter was handled by the logistics, but even they did not work out. They started to build, German airplanes came and destroyed everything. Well, if you succeed, said Nikolai Sergeyevich Klei, it would be good to wash up. The regiment's deputy commander for supplies, Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Pachka, supported me and helped me with the purchase of timber. In one of the relatively quiet days of our life on the bridgehead, at the battalion NP appeared the platoon commander of the regimental reconnaissance. Peter Blokin's epaulettes bore a star. I congratulated him on his officer rank and asked, "No way, language is required." "Language, comrade captain, and not just any muddle-headed one. but an intelligent one. You're just a stone's throw away from the Germans. Let's try to visit them. Pyotr Yakovlevich stepped from foot to foot. Have you come to look for a place to pick up? So I understand? Yes, comrade captain, a place to search. Well, you've got the go-ahead. Take a look around, visit the front line. In the evening, I'll gather company commanders. We'll talk more about it. It's a common cause. I'll invite you too. Maybe together we'll think of something. At the last meeting at headquarters, the regiment commander, speaking about the enemy, noticed, according to intelligence, the Nazis to the bridgehead pull forces, but the data need confirmation. Maybe it's just a camouflage. The German fascist command pursues some other goal than to throw us off the bridgehead. After all, the enemy believes that there are still as many troops on the bridgehead as there were by the 10th of August. However, for this purpose, we have to demonstrate the concentration of troops from time to time. Special radio stations go on the air, pneumatic artillery and mortar batteries open fire on the targets identified in advance. At night, fires flare up in one place or another. It would be good to take a tongue curse, said Major Pavlyuk. Think about it, comrades. Who has any thoughts? Report. So far, the scouts have nothing to please us. The day before yesterday, they tried to take the tongue on the site of the 1st Battalion, unsuccessfully. 3 people lost and made noise for the whole bridgehead. Now Blokin was choosing a place in the area of our battalion's defence. In the evening, the conversation about the forthcoming search went with the company commanders. There were many suggestions. We agreed, search from the positions of the 5th Company, the first trench of which was closest to one of the enemy bunkers. Platoon commander of this company, Junior Lieutenant Nikolai Baikov, report. The Germans had recently left only the duty shift in the structure at night. This was worth taking advantage of. For more than a day, Blokin studied the life of the enemy's front line, and in the regimental rear were preparing scouts. The night chosen for the search turned out to be quiet and inclement weather. Since the evening it had been raining lightly. Rockets flashed dimly in the starless sky. The smell of damp. At the battalion NP gathered commanders of units, providing such an important operation for us. All looked impatiently at me, then at the phone, waiting for a report from the sappers and scouts. And when it seemed that there would be no end to the waiting, the phone rang. Picked up the phone, reported the commander of the 5th Company, Kovaly. Sappers made a passage. Scouts passed the first trench. Everything is going well. I looked around me, surrounded officers. Blokhin went. For about 20 minutes more, over the front edge was silence. But then it was cut by a long machine gun burst. It was followed by grenade explosions. Rockets ripped through the rainy sky. Tracer rounds danced across the neutral strip. The scouts had found themselves. There was nothing to delay with the opening of artillery fire now, otherwise the enemy could cut off the group's escape routes. Major Bereza reached for the telephone receiver. Almost immediately behind us, on the German defence, hit the batteries. They joined the mortars. The Hitlerites' front line was crossed by fiery traces of rockets, bursts of shells and mines. Their noise was absorbed by machine gun and machine gun bursts. The Germans responded immediately. A short but powerful blow of heavy mortars covered our trenches, firing positions, fell on the rear of the positions of artillerymen and mortarmen. There was a firing duel, which with small interruptions lasted almost until dawn. 15 minutes later, at the battalion's NP called the regiment commander. So are the scouts. Have they taken the tongue? They haven't reported yet. Yes, you. Pavlyuk thoughtfully stretched out. Ye. They made a lot of noise. At least it wasn't in vain. So the regiment commander hung up the phone. Almost immediately there was a new call. The commander of the 5th Company was almost shouting into the receiver. We got him, comrade captain. A big non-commissioned officer. He almost twisted Sergeant Yolga's cheekbone, but he still twisted him. Now the scouts are leading to the rear. Watch the noise. The Germans won't forgive us for a long time. They'll brutalize us. It's not going to happen. We won't allow it, comrade captain. Then I was connected to Pavlyuk. It turned out that Valentin Evtofevich had already been informed about the results of the search. I could feel from his voice that the regiment commander was very pleased. Thank the people involved in the search, and whoever you need, and present them to the award. So the prisoner confirmed the data of the intelligence about the arrival of new German units to our area. However, what is the size of the arrived contingent, he did not know. But what he reported was very valuable. The enemy was preparing to attack. It was necessary to take retaliatory measures. Without wasting time, we intensified the work on engineering equipment of the area. We dug out reserve firing positions for machine guns, anti-tank guns, put mines, wire fences. We intensified surveillance, increased the number of on-duty firearms, and what is not less important, knowing about possible actions of the enemy, we kept alert. In these days, radio and newspapers brought us happy news. After the Third Belarusian Front reached the borders of East Prussia north of Mariupol, the troops of our front liquidated the encircled group of the enemy north of Sandomir and liberated Dembith. The offensive of the troops of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian, 1st and 2nd Belarusian fronts developed successfully. On August 31, our troops, as well as the Romanian Volunteer Division, entered Bucharest, liberated by the patriotic forces of Romania. Good news came from the Baltic states. The end of August of the 44th was unusually rich in successes of the Soviet army. As the first month of fall came, the trees began to dress in a motley attire, often fell prolonged, fine rains. At night fogs crept from the Vistula River, bringing with them dampness and chills. The grass began to wither, first on the hills and then in the lowlands. Birds began to gather in flocks. In spite of shelling, bombing, fires, in moments of calm, huge flocks of starlings and pigeons flew around the fields. Nature was taking its course. Soldiers and commanders saw off the feathered birds with cheers and good wishes. The battalion was on combat duty. At the 2nd position, we organized the training of the replenishment that joined the companies and platoons. Officers, sergeants, experienced soldiers studied with newcomers the material part of weapons, grenades, mines, not only domestic production, but also the enemy. On the experience of past battles taught the newcomers fortitude in defense, swiftness in the offensive. In companies and platoons continued party political work. On the Bridgehead regularly published a divisional newspaper by Everts. I remember one of the issues was dedicated to distinguished soldiers, sergeants and officers. Soldiers read the materials, supplemented them with their comments. I especially remember the story about the exploits of Junior Sergeant Alexei Potapov. On the account of the mortar had already been a lot of glorious deeds. He was awarded the Order of the Red Star, the Order of Glory of the II degree medals, and now he distinguished himself again at reflection of an enemy counterattack. He destroyed a machine gun and over half a dozen Hitlerites, for what he was awarded the Order of Glory of the I degree. By the end of the war, he became a full cavalier of this order. In those days, great events were taking place in Europe. In the capital of Bulgaria began an armed uprising. The reactionary government was overthrown and formed a new government of the Patriotic Front, led by Georgiev, which declared war on Nazi Germany. Political information was devoted to this event in the battalion. Major Nikolai Afanasyevich Kuryabin telling about the courageous struggle of the Bulgarian people under the leadership of the Bulgarian Workers' Party. The bloc of Hitler's coalition is collapsing. Romania came out of the war on the side of Nazi Germany and declared war on her. Following her, Finland, now Bulgaria. The land of Europe is burning under the feet of Nazi invaders. From the reports of Sovinformbureau, it became known the troops of our front completed the defensive battles on the Sandomir bridgehead. During the battles, the enemy counterattacks were successfully repulsed. The troops began to prepare a new offensive operation. In our area, the enemy continued to accumulate forces. According to observers' reports, in his defense there were new firepower. Several mortar and artillery batteries were detected. On the front line noticed direct fire guns, the fascists have activated all kinds of reconnaissance. So from day to day we should expect a new attempt of the enemy to throw us into the Vistula. We understood this and prepared for a repulse. The night of September 11 came. I couldn't sleep. I came out of the dugout. After the stuffiness of the room, I breathed in the fresh air with pleasure. I listened. Above the front line, silence. No rockets. Constant companions of the front line. No chatter of machine guns on duty. What would that mean? A rustle of footsteps made him look back. From the neighbouring dugout were coming machine gunners. The sergeant was going to report about the arrival, but I waved my hand, and we went towards the front. We moved in silence. I remembered the reports of the locals. Recently they continued to confirm the data on the Nazi build-up of forces and means on our section of the front. Poles told about the appearance of tanks and artillery in the nearest settlements. The day before, the regiment conducted a reconnaissance battle. While the reinforced rifle company attacked the enemy stronghold, scouts from the front trench managed to take away 2 German soldiers. They showed that on the bridgehead arrived parts of the 26th Infantry Division. Now against our division stood 2 reinforced infantry divisions, a more than serious symptom. Yesterday in the evening from the rear of the Hitlerites came the rumble of engines. No other way than new reinforcements have arrived. All this could not but sharpen our sense of responsibility, cause anxiety. When a man is on the front line, some special instinct is developed, allowing to feel the impending danger and even to foresee events. I have not yet figured out what we should expect, but I felt intuitively that something must happen. I was drawn to people. I wanted to look them in the eye, to exchange a word with them. There was still silence around. There was a chill from the Vistula. Somewhere in the pools a duck cried out, gathering its young that had already taken wing. The slanting horn of the moon was slowly setting behind the horizon, and the path trodden by dozens of soldiers' boots. We walked briskly to the front line. We descended into the passage of communication. From it we got into a well-equipped trench in full profile. Commanders of duty units, warned of my exit, met and reported on the situation. There was nothing suspicious in the enemy's behavior, except for what I noticed. The enemy did not launch rockets, and their machine guns on duty were silent. At one of the machine gun emplacements of the 5th Rifle Company, a group of soldiers was shortening the night. At my appearance, Junior Lieutenant Bykov got up, put his hand to his headdress, was about to report, but I was ahead of him. "No need, Nikolai Vasilievich. Duty shift?" "That's right, Comrade Captain," answered Bykov. "I'm having a conversation." "What is the conversation about, if it's not a secret?" "We have one conversation, to throw the enemy out of Poland." Bykov looked at me. "Finish the fascists in their own lair, as the regiment agitator says, and then go home." "Well, that's too general. To be more specific, I'm telling the youth about the first day of the forcing. I remember how the Krauts came at us in droves. We mow with machine guns and automatic rifles, hit them with rifles, but they were coming. I remember the guys. Many of them are no longer with us. Sergeant Zatnoy, the junior lieutenant waved his hand and sighed heavily. Bykov on the day of forcing the Vistula was wounded. He was treated and returned to the bridgehead. He took his platoon. I, admittedly, was happy for him. During the first meeting, I congratulated him on his recovery, asked about his health. "Normal," answered then Bykov, although the pale, sickly face of the junior lieutenant clearly contradicted the cheerful answer. Now here was a new meeting. "No. How are you feeling, Nikolai Vasilievich?" "All right, apart from the little things. The Krauts have gotten a little too crazy lately, but now, surprisingly, they've calmed down. Are they up to something?" "Who knows? I don't like it either. Germans are pedantic people. They stick to the letter of the manual, and now they've changed their routine. I think it'll be all right, though." "Maybe you'd like to join us for a smoke," Bykov suggested. "No, I want to look in the 6th. "It's up to you," said the junior lieutenant regretfully. "We would have organized a cup of tea." "Thank you, Nikolai Vasilievich." After Serpukin in the 6th, everything fell on the sergeant's shoulders. Senior Lieutenant Peter Serpukin, who headed after Chugunov's death the 6th Company during one of the Hitlerite counterattacks, was mortally wounded. On the way to the medical center, he died. In the location of the 6th Company, which occupied the defense on the slope of a small hill, flowed the same life as in other units of the battalion. Observers were on duty, shifts were on standby. The soldiers were animated at my appearance. It was not difficult to understand them. A commander on the front line at such an hour, when there is incomprehensible, restless silence all around, it calms and encourages, raises their spirits. Meanwhile, the morning was approaching. The stars were turning pale and losing their luster. It became somewhat colder. Meeting with the fighters brought relief, but did not calm down completely. Somewhere inside lurked a wary premonition. I chased it away, tried to think about my past life, about my native Siberian places, on which the same stars that hovered over our bridgehead were now looking from the abyss of the universe. I had no sooner returned to the battalion MP and went into the dugout than the phone rang. The liaison officer handed me the receiver. "You're awake too." "A habit, Sisha, and something doesn't feel right today." "Me too." There's silence from my mouth. Isn't it before the storm? I decided to call you. Turns out I'm not the only one with doubts. I've doubled my guard here. They say God protects the wiser, even though we're non-believers. I advise you to do the same. Thank you, Nikolai Yakovlevich. You'll thank me later. We're doing the same thing. Didn't they send anyone to replace me? No, they haven't appointed anyone yet. Yes, one more thing. My advice to you. Move the mortars, machine gunners and anti-tankers to the reserve firing positions. The Krauts must have detected the main ones. They'll fire on them first. Nikolai Yakovlevich Bukharin, a cautious, prudent man. For timely advice, I was sincerely grateful to him. Having given the necessary orders, I shaved and sat down to the table. The orderly appeared in the door. Comrade Captain, breakfast is ready. Can I serve it? I don't feel like it. I waved my hand. Maybe at least have some tea, insisted the fighter. All right, bring your tea, and invite Captain Presnyakov here as well. The soldier went out. I unfolded the battalion defense scheme, ran my eyes over the engineering structures, and suddenly there was a rumble, such a rumble that the logs creaked and streams of earth flowed from the ceiling, followed by another terrible blow. Another. The door flew open with a crash, and the hinges flew off its hinges. An artillery attack went through my mind. Is it possible that they have spotted the headquarters? They didn't give any reason for it. They were in disguise. A shadow flashed in the doorway, and together with another rumble, Presnyakov literally flew into the dugout under the pressure of an air wave. What a nail! Igor Tarasovich shook his head. You can't see light all over the bridgehead. Fiddlers are hammering hard. We called heavy German mortars fiddlers. A new blow shook the dugout. The logs of the rampart moved. Streams of earth turned into earth streams. The corner of the ceiling began to subside. The dugout was filled with dust and the sour smell of TNT. There was nothing to breathe. Into the trench, thought flashed. The logs will pile up. Come out, come out. I shouted. It'll fall in, come out. But the adjutant in charge and the liaison officers realized without that it was necessary to leave. Nakat cracks continues to settle. Everyone rushes to the exit. The message passage is met with stench. Face and chest are showered with clods of earth. We bump into someone, and one by one we fall. Beneath us, someone groans and grunts. My arms and legs are crushed. It turned out to be a sentry. He ducked down in the trench from shrapnel, and we fell. I get up, spit dust on the berm. I try to make sense of what's going on. There is still rumbling, howling, whistling. The earth is mixed with the sky. The walls of the trench shake, but resist the destructive force of the explosions. That this is no ordinary artillery attack is clear to me. The rumble is over the entire bridgehead. I remember the intelligence of the last few days about the concentration of the enemy on our section of the front. Maybe this is the answer to the question that tormented us about the intentions of Hitler's command. Some unknown force makes me straighten up. Once again, I cast a glance at the defense area. Trenches, passages, firing positions of artillery and mortars are drowned in fire and smoke. The same picture, on the right and left of the neighbours in the rear. The command post of the regiment, located behind the mountain behind us, is also covered with the smoke of explosions, as well as the firing positions of howitzer gunners on the right. Any communication with the companies? I turned to Sergeant Zvyagelsky. Sarah, Aunt as if lost his mind, stared at me incomprehensibly. I had to repeat the question, and only then he realized, rushed inside. A few minutes later he came back. It was easy to guess from his frustrated face that there was no connection. Oh, I see. I waved my hand. Zvyagelsky turned again and disappeared into the dugout. Meanwhile, the enemy continued to shower us with shells and mines. Then the fascist assault aviation came and began to irradiate the firing positions of artillery and mortar batteries and flamethrowers. A thick blue stench filled the surroundings, tickled my nose, made my throat sore, cut my eyes. Nearby, Presnyakov blurted out. Who was he sneezing at? Igor Tarasovich from his knee was firing at the departing German planes. But a new wave of vultures had already spilled out to replace them from behind Gurno. The first trenches were mined. The fascists aimed at our rear. A crazy explosion shook the ground. In the air, like light matches, mangled logs were overturned. They must have hit our bathhouse. Those bastards. The planes went into a dive again. An ear-splitting howl ripped through the neighborhood, forcing all living things to press into the ground. Blood rushed to his head. Crouching down, I managed to glance at Presnyakov. Igor Tarasovich's face was greying, taking on an earthy hue. A thought flashed about the soldiers and officers in the trenches. How do they bear it there? Would they not tremble in this hell of fire? I tried to drive away my doubts, but the danger looming over the battalion was becoming more and more alarming. I realized that I had to do something immediately, but what should I do? I know from my own experience, people in such a situation need a kind word, but there's no connection. To send telephonists to the line is certain death, and it's dangerous to wait any longer. After this mess, the fascists will surely attack. Zygelski. The sergeant turned around, undoing the top button of his jacket, but it wouldn't budge. Zygelski tore the collar with frustration. The buttons flew apart, exposing a thin neck with sweat. There must be a connection. Yes, sir. The sergeant disappeared in the course of the message. 5 minutes later, our Air Force arrived. There was a merry go-round in the sky, but we didn't have time for it. The Germans began shelling the battalion's defense area with heavy mortars. With a screech and howl, the mines blew up huge clods of earth, trenches and dugouts. Gah, gah, ah, was heard from behind, from the front, from the sides. It seemed that the earth itself was about to burst, to split apart in this infernal whirlwind of rumbling, explosions and fire. Everything around was drowning in the black-brown gloom. Anxiety crawled into my heart. No, not for myself. For the people, the bridgehead to which so much was given, and with which human lives and deaths tied us in a tight knot. The memory of the fallen on this piece of land called, ordered not to tarnish our honor, the honor of the Russian soldier. In my temples, as on the first day of forcing, was pounding. To withstand, to withstand, to withstand. I tried to see what was happening in the company trenches, in the firing positions of mortars, artillerymen, anti-tank gun crews. But still it was difficult to understand anything in the vortex of fire, cinders and smoke. Is it really all dead? No, it can't be. All at once do not die. Say, hold on, meek down. A new barrage of whistling shells made me duck again. A voice broke through the gap. Comrade Captain, I found the guys. I turned around. Pressed against the wall of the trench stood Sergeant Zygelski. Behind him, with automatic rifles in his hands, 2 soldiers were looking at me expectantly. Through the yellowish-brown dust that powdered their faces, there was a pallor. Their shoulders shuddered every now and then. Beside them, blocking the passage, lay 2 spools of coloured cable and a telephone set. Are they newcomers? That's right, Comrade Captain. New recruits. Zygelski answered for them. They arrived the day before yesterday with the replenishment. The sergeant was calm, collected. More than once he had been in such trouble, he had already recovered from the surprise. He looked at the soldiers and smiled miserably. What are you guys doing? It's not a big deal, I've been cleaner than that, blue pigeons. It's too early for us to die. Not everything is done on this land yet. We still owe the Krauts and you're hanging your noses. Well, the German is angry. He'll get over it, he'll calm down. It's not the first time for him. Zygelski didn't seem to say anything special, but I saw that the liaison men were cheerful. Meanwhile, the enemy continued to shell the front line with the same anger. It lasted for about an hour. Then the fascists transferred the fire to the positions of regimental and divisional reserves. A series of shells and mines flew through us and began to rumble in the rear. Fascist bombers also dropped their cargo there. We had a relative calm, although still the battalion defense area was drowned in darkness. But here came a light September breeze, and clouds of dust and cinders floated towards the Vistula. For a few minutes I saw profiles of mangled trenches, tortured firing positions of artillerymen and mortarmen, where, to my joy and relief, people were already working. Alive, did not flinch, so we will fight, and this is the main thing. Knowing from experience that the respite given to us would not last long, that the enemy was about to concentrate firepower on the front line again, we tried to use it fully. In the companies rushed communicators, orderlies, messengers. Without wasting time, we began to tidy up the battalion NP. Captain Presnyakov mobilized everyone who happened to be around. After about 10 minutes, the question of losses, which had been tormenting me all along, became clear. They turned out to be less than I expected. The material part suffered even less. It was due to the fact that artillery, mortars, machine guns, anti-tank guns had managed to move to the reserve firing positions. The personnel also moved there. Hitlerites concentrated the bulk of fire on the identified targets, that is, for the most part on the main positions. Nikolai Yakovlevich Bukharin's advice was just right. How not to thank him once again? The liaison officers managed to fix the lines of communication with the 6th Company and the mortars in a short time. But then the fascists again transferred their artillery fire to us. Once again, the minutes of waiting dragged on. This time, the enemy's artillery preparation involved direct fire guns. In a matter of minutes, we lost several bunkers. The point is that during the previous hour and a half of shelling, the camouflage of the front line had suffered, and what was invisible before was now exposed. It made no sense to restore the camouflage in front of the German observers, and there was no time for that. Not everywhere the companies had time to clear even blocked trenches, passages, trenches, to correct the cells for shooting, firing positions of machine guns and anti-tank guns. The tornado of continuous fire once again danced across the defense. Bombs, shells, and mines continued to destroy what for the last weeks had been erected by soldiers' hands on this patch of ground. It was built to hold on, to withstand the fire, and the Saviour Earth was now sheltering the people. For more than an hour, the enemy beat on our defense from all kinds of weapons. It burned and smoked, rattled and rattled so much that it made my ears ache. It seemed that we were about to burst, and that now there was not a single living soul in the neighbourhood. But when the Nazis stopped their artillery fire, soldiers began to come out of the trenches, dugouts and crevices, not recognizing the torn and burnt earth around them. Through binoculars, I could see how, swaying, stood up Company Commander Senior Lieutenant Odegov. Dmitry Mikhailovich threw a glance to the right, left, back, said something to the soldier who appeared from the gap, ducking between the funnels. The soldier ran towards the first trench, where soldiers' helmets were already glimpsed from time to time. Odegov immediately called another one and hurriedly began to say something to him, every now and then pointing his hand in the direction of Sisha. The soldier nodded and rushed to the right flank, where the regimental company of anti-tank guns occupied the defence, and only then the murmur of engines reached me. It filled the surroundings slowly, but imperiously, as if behind the gardens of the village took the acceleration of unrolling millstones. Alexander Terentievich, Captain Presniakov, touched my shoulder. Company commander's report. There is a rumble of tanks. No way, the Germans are preparing to attack. I can hear it myself, Igor Tarasovich. Our conversation was interrupted by the voice of Sergeant Zverigelsky. The regiment commander is on the wire, Comrade Captain. Major Pavliuk asked with concern in his voice about the losses. Replied Valentin Yevstafievich that 40 men were out of action, and the mortars lost only 3 soldiers. Only these data without taking into account the last shelling. Thank you. You've made me happy, I heard in reply, because there's bad news here. Good for you, old tuning. Wait for guests, and don't take a step back. Understand me? Tell me more often. It's going to be a hot day, I guess. No, I understand. Yes, hold on. That's good. Where's Major Kalyabin? He is with the anti-tankers. Good. Take care of Nikolai Afanasyevich. You're responsible with your head. Yes, take care of him. But it's hard to keep him at headquarters. He wants to go to the front line, to the men. Don't let him go, combat. Don't let him in. That's all. Nay, I'll try, Comrade Major. Pavliuk hung up the phone. From the right flank suddenly came the rumble of gunfire. German self-propelled vehicles and tanks, machine guns and automatic rifles rumbled thickly. The sky of the northern outskirts of Sisha was streaked with missile tracers, cutting through the thick reddish dust over the houses and gardens of the settlement. The Germans were attacking the Krasovs. Captain Presniakov intercepted my gaze. The enemy was striking at the 828th Vladimir Volinsky Infantry Regiment. The plan of the German fascist command was not difficult to understand. Having broken through the defence of the Krasovians, the fascists came to the Vistula and, crushing the divisional rear, cut off regiments and battalions from the river, depriving us of supplies, with all the ensuing consequences. It is difficult to say when this idea came to the Nazis. Obviously, in the course of previous hard fighting, they were convinced that they could not take us head-on. Last days, they left alone the 828th Regiment, concentrated the main efforts on the defence of our regiment. Battalions of Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Krasovsky took the force of the first, ramming blow. We fought almost without artillery. During the enemy artillery preparation, regimental batteries were mostly out of action. The attached artillery also suffered great damage. Soldiers and commanders met the German infantry with rifle and machine gun fire. With tanks fought armoured gunners. It is not easy to crush and trample the Soviet soldier, who bore on his shoulders a lot of things that even after decades will surprise the world. Stunned by explosions, covered with earth, wounded Krasovtsi stood up from cells, rose from trenches, fought to the last. The question, who is who, during the first German attack was not solved. The Germans managed only to seize the position of the combat guard. Having pulled up fresh forces, they again rushed on the tortured defence of the regiment, so the battle gained even more force. At the same time, the enemy struck at the defence of the 862nd Vladimir Volinsky Rifle Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Kozhevnikov. The armoured fist came on the right flank. The fascists pushed forward companies and broke through to the second trench. A hand-to-hand fight ensued. Kozhevnikov fights. Major Modin oriented me. Krasovsky also holds the front line. The situation every minute can change. Be ready for anything. Nikolai Sergeyevich, despite the anxious situation, spoke calmly. Asked me about the progress of work to restore the destroyed areas of defence. The Germans do not let us raise our heads. At the slightest gathering of people, open artillery and machine gun fire. What did you think? They didn't destroy it, give you a chance to rebuild your defences. I want to warn you. The fascists are not accidentally watching the battalion's defence area. By the way, not only yours, but others as well. The enemy is preparing a strike. You're on our spearhead, so don't fail. Soon the assumption of the chief of staff of the regiment came true. In 15 to 20 minutes, the observers reported the appearance of tanks from behind the nearest hills. Every minute, their rumbling became stronger and stronger, gradually drowning out the rumble of battle. 1, 2, 3, Presnyakov was counting aloud next to me. EA 10, 12. Behind them came the self-propelled guns, and between them, a thick wave of infantry, transferring my eyes from flank to flank and into the depth of the defence. I became more and more convinced that it would be difficult to stop the steel avalanche with the available forces. The fighter anti-tank battery attached to the battalion was damaged during the enemy's artillery preparation. It was the same with a platoon of anti-tank. Out of 340 guns, only one was in service. All hope was on the artillery regiment, Major Valentin Bereza and soldiers' hands. I looked for Sergeant Zviagelsky. The liaison man was working on the telephone. Do you have contact with the companies? Yes, all of them. Mo. Put me through to the commanders. First on the wire was Senior Lieutenant Odigov. Dmitry Mikhailovich, let the tanks through the trenches. They'll be met here. Your task is to cut off the infantry and destroy them. I told the rest of the company men the same thing. I knew that now from trench to trench, from crevice to crevice, from cell to cell comes a command, the meaning of which is clear for every soldier. Cut off infantry, tanks to pass through. This command will somewhat relieve the tension, give people confidence. German tanks from 800 meters opened fire from guns. Sultans of the earth stood all over the battalion's defences. They're nervous, you bastards. Someone behind me gritted his teeth. I turn around. Major Kulyabin. Nikolai Afanasyevich is in a soiled uniform. It seems that he had to cling to the ground more than once, to crawl, or even to bury himself in densely scattered craters, until he got to the battalion. He looked ahead and frowned his bushy eyebrows. Felt errantly, already aware of the persistence of our neighbours. Of course, Comrade Major. It's the whistle of the shell. The rumble of the rupture muffled the last words. Shrapnel shrieks. A wave of compressed air hits our ears. Lumps of soil fall on the berm and in the trench. Involuntarily, we clung to the walls. Continuing to fire, the tanks slow down, probably waiting for the infantry. Our artillerymen are hitting them. You can see how the shells ricochet on the frontal armour. They won't take them. With annoyance bursts out from me. They will, Major Kolyabin reassures. They must take them. As if in response to his words, one of the tanks slowed down, began to turn on the spot, fatefully exposing the side of our artilleryman. Almost immediately, 2 shots struck. MD and Psi machine stood a black column of smoke. Ready. It's a start. Somehow at once the tension that prevented me from concentrating fell. I raised binoculars to my eyes. I could clearly see yellowish-grey lines of trenches with torn sides, clods of earth thrown out by explosions, dents of craters darken, someone's helmet shines. And on the neutral strip protrudes the smoked hulk of a burnt-out German tank with a long gun barrel packed into the ground. After him in the field of vision got going in our direction enemy vehicles. Polished tracks glisten in the sun, clearly visible ribbed sides, triplexes on the front wall of the frontal armour. From the barrels of their guns now and then spews flame. German tankers concentrated fire on the position of the battery, one gun overturned, another lying on its side. At the rest of the slamming calculation, without headgear stands an officer and gives commands. I try to remember who commands the calculations, but in the thick smoke that covered the position, I cannot determine, although the figure is familiar. Lieutenant Kostrov, I guessed. But then a new explosion obscures the officer. Once again, I turn my binoculars to the German tanks. Another one is ready. Well done, artilleryman. Soon a third car bursts into flames. However, this does not stop the Nazis. The squat boxes continue to creep forward. Here the tanks reach the boundary of the range of fire of anti-tank guns. Immediately fireflies sparkled on their armour. It is the combatants of Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Shabanov. Armoured gunners hit the slits, but so far to no avail. The Germans are also firing intensely. They do not spare shells. They know that at close range the tank becomes vulnerable to anti-tank guns. Another tank spun on the spot and was enveloped in smoke, but then our defence was hit by German self-propelled guns. Heavy shells with a deafening tearing sound began to burst in trenches, dugouts, in firing positions, turning out piles of earth. The howitzer gunners answered from our side. All around was again covered with smoke. Something was tearing, whooshing, rattling, groaning. However, this was only a prelude to the dramatic events that unfolded that day, which for more than 30 years I cannot recall without excitement, nor can I separate one from the other. They are all important, all major. I will tell you how they remained in my memory. The shaft of the German attack came close to our first trench. In front of still tanks, behind them, a dense chain of infantry, further self-propelled guns. On both sides of the artillery beats are firing machine guns, automatic rifles. I am looking forward to the results of the Flamethrowers' work. The anti-Nick approached the boundary of the landfills laid by them. Mentally, I begin to hurry up and scold the Samoverniki. That's how we nicknamed the Flamethrowers on the bridgehead. Maybe the wires were torn during the artillery preparation. But I chase this thought away. I hope. And when I already decide to give up hope, in the junction of the 4th and 5th companies there is a step of fire, and only then muffled explosions are heard. The flames temporarily engulf several tanks and part of the German infantry chain. Wow! Can't stand someone nearby. What a cock the Krauts have thrown up! In some places torches flare up some more. Hitler's infantrymen flee in different directions, but almost no one manages to jump out of the flames. Tanks and armoured personnel carriers are spinning and crushing their own. Wild cries are heard. The enemy's battle formation is breaking down before our eyes. Look, look, here they give, shout communicators and messengers from the companies near the battalion NP. The Krauts don't like the roast. Look how they're running around, vipers. It was not difficult to understand the reason for this shouting. Our extreme tension demanded a release, and if the officers restrained themselves, the soldiers reacted violently to the situation. However, Flamethrowers only slowed down, but did not stop the enemy. A few minutes later, the first wave of advancing Germans caught up with the second. The attack continued. Several enemy tanks jumped out on the first trench, and undermining the tracks of the weight that the soldiers could not hide in the gaps and niches of the bunkers, overran. But now the enemy's fighting machines went forward slowly and cautiously. Either they were afraid of new surprises, or they were waiting for their infantry, or perhaps both together. Our artillerymen were hitting them from the left flank, but the shells only shot sparks out of the frontal and turret armour. I kept waiting for our Zvro boys, a battery of 57 mm guns attached to the battalion, to strike, knowing that their shells penetrate even the armour of the praised Tigers. But the batteries were silent, and I brought binoculars to my eyes. The firing position opened up. It was ploughed over by the explosions of heavy shells and air bombs, all in craters. A barrel with a shield and a frame were lying on the turned-out ground. 20 meters away, another gun was lying with its wheels up. The others were not visible. Maybe they were in shelters. But why still? Igor Tarasevich, have you heard from the anti-tank battery? No communication. Send a messenger. We can't wait any longer. An unpleasant chill ran down my back. My heart ached. He himself had experienced the same thing that the soldiers in the trenches were feeling now. You lie at the bottom of a trench or a crevice, clenching your fists in impotent anger. You crave fire support more than anything else in the world. Above you there is only a patch of sky. From the looming hulk of the tank, the ground rumbles and crumbles. It's not a pleasant thing. And not everyone can bear it. It takes courage. In the Crimea, I saw how at the last moment a fighter, unable to stand it, jumped out of the gap. He thought he could escape to the rear, and then he found his death from a machine gun, but a bitter, inglorious end. Contempt of comrades and commanders left behind him. In general, not a frail dozen soldiers. That's what is a momentary weakness, fear. Looking around the battlefield, I must confess, I was proud of my men. No one trembled, did not show the enemy his back. I thought of something to help them, to ease their fate in this difficult moment, and when helmets began to appear in the trench, which was shattered by artillery preparation, bombing and tank tracks, machine guns, rifles hit the enemy chain, I breathed a sigh of relief, although I realized that the situation was still critical. The German infantry, encountering persistent return fire, began to pile up and lay in small folds of the hills. However, shallow cover did not save it. Companies, as they call it, that choice-beat enemy soldiers and officers, did not let them raise their heads. The Nazis began to look for a way out of the situation, but to find it was not so easy. Our machine gunners and gunners continued to shoot. Sparked by explosions, the defense was impregnable. Nazi tanks were burning. 3 cars were the share of platoon of Senior Lieutenant Emmanuel Shalaganidze. Later, in the evening, there were relatively quiet minutes, and the company commander, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Odigov, reported to me the details of the battle, which was impossible to listen to without excitement. Tanks with a roar and scraping over the broomsticks, covered cells and trenches. It felt as if a mountain landslide was rolling down on you. The ground trembled and shrank under the weight of steel machines. Everything was drowned in dust and smoke. It seemed that there should be no place for the living here. But as soon as the tanks passed by, commands were heard and grenades flew into the tail of the steel hulks. No sooner had the walls of the trenches crumbled than the soldiers stood up out of the dust, black with soot. They stood up with weapons in defiance of death and fear. With a bundle of grenades tied with a belt rose Private Mihorsky and rushed after the tank. Mihorsky ran up to the tank, swung, and suddenly his hand with a bunch of grenades, slowly described a semicircle, fell down powerlessly. The soldier crumpled to the ground. Shalaganidze jumped out of the trench and ran after the tank until he caught up with it at a sure throw. "Take that, you creep," exhaled the senior lieutenant and, with force, sent an anti-tank grenade into the stern of the fighting machine. He did not watch its flight. He was sure that it would hit him. He rushed back to the trench. An explosion rumbled from behind, and splinters rumbled nearby. I managed to see the soldiers dragging Mihorsky to the trench, and then something heavy hit him in the back. Emmanuel Nestorovich did not feel any pain. By inertia, he continued to run until he tripped over a dislodged block of earth near the trench, and then the whole body was cut by an intolerable fire. But Shalaganidze held back, did not scream, but only gritted his teeth. He remained silent a minute later, when the soldiers picked him up and dragged him into the collapsed rifle cell. Shalaganidze was bandaged. Emmanuel Nestorovich moaned, lost consciousness. Nothing, said the sergeants and instructor. Now it will be easier. Don't persuade me, Katso. I'm not a child. I understand everything. How's it going with Mihorsky? Maybe he's alive? I wrote him a recommendation to the party. It's in my field bag. Give it to him. No, he just left. The soldiers brought Mihorsky on a trench coat. His young face, covered with dust, was still alive. His features had not yet had time to sharpen. 2 small tears glistened at the bridge of his nose in the corners of his eyes. Shalaganidze reached them with the fingers of his left hand, wiped them away, and whispered with pain in his voice. How could you not be safe? Germans suddenly came from the trench. German infantry at the junction with the 5th broke through. Sergeant Ivanov to me, demanded Shalaganidze. A minute later, Emmanuel Nestorovich gave instructions to his deputy to destroy the broken enemy. He did not allow himself to be evacuated to the rear. He continued to lead the battle until his last breath. The head of the political department, Colonel Peter Grigorevich Zhivego, in his political report about him, will write, Party commander of the 4th Rifle Company, Senior Lieutenant Shalaganidze was wounded during the reflection of the enemy attack. He continued to lead the battle to destroy the hated enemy, while the heart of a communist was beating. But let me return to the events of those anxious minutes at the battalion NP. I had no time to look through binoculars on the right flank of the defence, where the 6th Company was fighting off the advancing fascists, as I heard an excited voice. Artillerymen grease their heels. There, look, in the ravine they are flying away, 150 metres from the firing line. I cast an anxious glance at the winding ravine going to our rear. Indeed, from cover to cover soldiers were running. Make sure it's not be them. They were. I spotted them from the firing line. I looked for the orderly. Vorontsov was sitting with an automatic rifle at the exit of the message passage. Called him to him, pointed at the group of men retreating. Immediately to them, bring back to the firing line. Tell them, the company is bleeding. Fire on the tanks that broke through. But while the orderly bypassed under enemy fire to get to the anti-tankers and, calling on the help of the soldiers' vocabulary, stopped them, the battery commander appeared at the NP, in a torn uniform with a bandaged hand. Staggering, the captain came up to me and tiredly exhaled. All the end. Kraut's caterpillars suppress the infantry. Go to the rear. There is one gun left in the battery. What are you talking about? I burst out. Companies are alive, fighting, and you panicked, damn you. You should have stopped. Do you understand, Novikov? There's no one in the trenches. Your men are all dead. At that time, the telephonist called me. Comrade Captain, Odigov is on the wire. Let's go. I pulled Novikov with me. You'll see. People are fighting, and you, He took the phone from the hands of the telephonist. Hello, Dmitry Mikhailovich. At last, Comrade Captain. Odigov spoke excitedly in reply. There was such a thing that it was difficult to report at once. We had no time to let the tanks through. As the German infantry piled up, we beat and the Krauts are piling on. We could hardly stop them. Now we're finishing those who broke through on the flank with our neighbour. No, thank you, Dmitry Mikhailovich. Give my thanks to the men. Comrade Captain, I'm here about something. From the direction of Sisha, we can hear the rumble of engines. The Germans are preparing for another attack. We could use a little more fire, some artillery fire. The battery behind us is silent. I've got the artilleryman. I'll pass the phone to Novikov because he's already sent you to the dust, and he's come here with his men. The captain took the phone, listened to Odigov, and silently went to the exit from the NP. I did not say anything more to him, realizing that the conversation with the company commander is enough. 15 minutes later, Novikov was at the battery. The officer ran up to the remaining gun and extended his hand to the gun commander, Senior Sergeant Peter Korkshin, who ran after him. The latter put in his open palm the panorama which he had taken when leaving the firing line. Me, Korchin, load. While Novikov was setting the panorama, Staff Sergeant Korchin grabbed a shell from the ditch and pushed it into the breach. The wedge of the bolt rang deafeningly. Combat threw a glance at the front edge. The company trench at this minute ironed fascist tank. Oh, you bastard, Novikov gritted his teeth, rotating the aiming mechanisms. You're crushing our men. The crosshairs of the sight crawled along the mangled bunkers, picking out the black smoke, until it came to the side of the enemy tank. Novikov pressed the trigger. The gun shuddered. Reddish-blue lightning struck the tank. Combat again hastily led the sight along the front edge, searching for a target. He was sure that he had stopped the enemy machine. Behind his back he heard a shout. Comrade Captain, tanks. Tanks on the right. Comrade Captain. The voice of the commander of the reconnaissance department, Tomylin, made Novikov break away from the sight. But then flames flashed before his eyes. Something elastic and hot splashed into his chest and face. Terrible force tore Novikov and threw him aside. When he came to his senses and knelt, spitting up the ground, the first thing he saw was Korchin's face, covered with blood and covered in wide stains of gunpowder gash. Meteor? Novikov called out to him. Pyotr, are you alive? Korchin did not move. Blood was curdling at the corners of his lips, his chin was sharpening before his eyes. Murdered. Novikov drove his blurred gaze farther and came upon Tomylin lying there. Novikov, leaning his hand on the bed, stood up. 200 meters away, firing, 2 tanks were crawling at an oblique angle towards the howitzer firing line. Captain Novikov looked at Tomylin. The scout had already regained consciousness. Nazasali here. The senior sergeant turned at the voice. On all fours, crawled to the bed. The two of them turned the gun in the direction of the enemy. Tomylin, with a clang, sent a shell into the breach. Novikov caught in the crosshairs of the tank and pressed the trigger, and a shot rang out. Combat corrected the aiming and sent another shell. The tank was shrouded in smoke. The same fate befell the second enemy vehicle. Then they were firing on armoured personnel carriers, infantry. Tomlin, loaded, Novikov, fired, until they were covered with a direct hit of the shell of the enemy self-propelled vehicle. Remembering about artillerymen, tank fighters, I cannot but say that on that day many of them had to drink the bitter cup of soldiers' fate to the bottom. In the archival documents I came across a record about the feat of the 1st Battery of the same division. It was commanded on that difficult day by Lieutenant Dmitry Lebedev, with whom I had met many times during the past battles. The enemy bypassed the firing position of the battery and went to the assault. Artillerymen repulsed the enemy with guns and machine guns, trophy machine gun. Several times the fascists offered them to surrender. Batteries responded with fire. The Germans again went on the attack. Artillerymen took up small arms. The fight flared up with renewed vigour. Automatic rifles knocked, shots of carbines slammed, hand grenades flew into Hitlerites. And so until deep night. In the darkness, the surviving artillerymen moved to the breakthrough. From all brave men, only Senior Sergeant Alexander Popov and some soldiers managed to get through. Having taken a blow of enemy tanks, the fighter anti-tank division inflicted great damage to the enemy, although it suffered losses. On the battlefield were killed the division commander Captain Arseny Kiselov, Adjutant Senior Captain Pavel Bogomazov, the division's party leader Lieutenant Pavel Glukov, platoon commanders Anatoly Afonin, Nikolai Efimov, and many other officers, sergeants, soldiers, people who had many big and small battles. The enemy continued to attack us. Sometimes he was able to move forward and even cross the combat order of rifle companies. But some time passed, and from the burnt, ploughed by bombs, shells and mines, trenches and dugouts, fighters stood up. The defence came to life. The remnants of departments, platoons and companies fought in the encirclement, broke through enemy obstacles and joined the main forces. We did not notice how day replaced night. By morning the fascists increased the blow. Under the onslaught of the enemy, 828th Rifle Regiment was forced to withdraw. Hitlerites broke into Sisha. With variable success, the battle for the settlement lasted until noon. Separate houses changed hands several times. Sisha, and then by evening Lesnyi Kalopy had to be abandoned. The enemy came to the flank and rear of the 862nd Rifle Regiment, which before this was also forced to abandon the first position. On the battalions of Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Koshevnikov, the fascists pressed from the front and flanks. Especially tragically developed events in the 2nd Battalion. The enemy managed to cut off the command and observation post of the commander from the companies to surround him. The battalion commander Potapov, his deputy on political part Senior Lieutenant Masloboynikov, Adjutant Senior Lieutenant Druzhinin, Battalion Partorg Senior Lieutenant Rodionov, Commissar Chief Petty Officer Shipetsin, signallers, ordinaries, messengers had to take up arms. For hours they held the defence, chaining the superior forces of the enemy. Ammunition was running out. Alexei Potapov broadcast, "We are dying, but not surrendering." Combat led the men to the breakthrough. With bayonet and grenade, a handful of brave men paved the way. In the hand-to-hand fight, the battalion's commissar and commissar, many soldiers and sergeants were killed. The 1st Battalion of the regiment also bled. Combat Captain Dmitry Shorin did not allow the Germans to cut off the companies from the battalion observation post, although they managed to come close to the headquarters. All those who were at that moment at the observation post entered into a fight with the fascists. Corps headquarters took measures to help us. With the forces of a regiment of the 106th Rifle Division, a reserve battalion and a special purpose company, after a short artillery attack, an attempt was made to dislodge the enemy from Lesny Kalu, but they managed to advance only a few dozen meters, although the battle lasted more than 4 hours. Despite the courage and steadfastness of our soldiers and commanders, the Germans continued to push the regiments of the division to the Vistula. The bridgehead was still wider than on the first day of forcing, but in depth in other places it reached only 2 kilometers. In fact, a narrow strip of land and a precipice separated the fighting orders from the channel, behind which there was almost nowhere to hide. For a month and a half of fighting, the shrubbery and the floodplain and on the bank of the Vistula was completely destroyed. At night and the next day the enemy continued to attack frantically, but the units held on as long as at least one man remained alive at the position. They held on even when the last grenade and the last cartridge were used up, with bayonet butt, sapper shovel. Everything that came to hand, the soldiers met the enemy. Our battalion held on. Every dozen meters were delivered to the fascists at the cost of huge losses. I had not seen such fierceness of fights even in the first days on the bridgehead. I listened anxiously to the rumble of battle approaching from the flank. Shooting was already heard in the rear. Suddenly behind, on the very bank of the channel, in the place where the command post of the regiment was located, he heard frequent bursts of shells. Overwhelmed with anxiety, I called the regimental headquarters. The telephonist on all questions frantically repeats, "Tanks, the fascists have broken through." With difficulty, I reach the commander of the communications company. "What's going on there?" "It's not good. Fascist tanks are coming in the rear from the right flank along the channel." "Report to the 3rd. Everything I can scrape together to help you." "Wait a minute. I'll find out what the 3rd will decide." I here in reply. While the commander of the communications company ran with the report to the chief of staff of the regiment, in my head drew pictures one more horrible than the other. I imagined how the tanks crush our rear, the wounded. Marina. As if in reality I imagined how Marina stands in the way of the Nazi tank, trying to block the wounded with her fragile figure. I remembered a case that happened in 1941 near Yartsevo, when Nazi tanks crushed a nurse of our battalion who covered the gap with wounded soldiers with her body. The 3rd forbade taking pictures of people from the front line. At last I hear an officer's voice in the tube. He said that you are required to do one thing. Do not retreat a step. That's how you'll help us. All right. Report to the 3rd. We will fulfill our task. Still, we scraped together 6 men, whom Presnyakov led to the headquarters in trouble. With unrelenting anxiety, I listened to the course of the battle that broke out in our rear. In the midst of the reflection of another Nazi attack, I was called to the machine by the telephonist. On the wire was the commander of the communications company. "How's it going?" "The same old, I'm hanging in there. Is that what's going on with you?" "It's happened. You'll find out afterwards. The commander is interested in you. I'll tell him you're hanging in there." Only on Presnyakov's return did I learn the details of the battle in the area of the regiment's headquarters. Having broken through to the CP, German tanks began to fire on trenches, dugouts, slots. Major Modin, the chief of staff, rushed to the battle banner, detached it from its shaft, wrapped the cloth around his chest and prepared for battle. But then a 40-50 shell hit the fascists. Its calculation set fire to an enemy fighting vehicle, damaged the 2nd tank. The rest, snapping fire, withdrew. The machine gunners who broke through with the tanks were destroyed by soldiers and officers of the headquarters and the commandant's platoon. I do not remember during which attack of the enemy called me to the phone Colonel Abashev, who took command of the division. Fyodor Semyonovich Danilovsky a few days ago went to the corps. It was said, Fyodor Fedorovich asked about the progress of repulsion of enemy attacks. I complained about the large loss of personnel, lack of artillery. It is difficult for everyone now, but we will help. For now, count on yourself. It seems that Colonel Abashev did not say anything special, but the tension decreased. And it is understandable. They remember you, know you, care about you. In the course of the battle advice, just a word of encouragement from a senior superior is never superfluous, and sometimes simply necessary. Even his voice gives confidence in the success of the case. I experienced something similar in those minutes. The enemy continued to press, looking for faults in our defense, tried to cut in one place or another. The enemy tanks suddenly broke through to the position of battalion mortars. The tankers were triumphant, looking at the mortar barrels sticking out of the trenches, the crates broken into splinters. One more center of resistance of the Russians was over. It remained only for certainty to pass tracks on the trenches and trenches down. Hitlerites did not see our survivors and could not see them, even before the German tanks approached. Lieutenant Mikhail Rebrushkin, the senior at the firing position, ordered the survivors to occupy the pre-prepared cells and trenches for firing, handed out hand and anti-tank grenades to his subordinates. The battery fired the last mines at 10 o'clock in the morning, and now it was already 12 o'clock. Night mid, boys. Watching the approaching steel hulks, the lieutenant passed along the chain. Let them come closer, hit them for sure. From somewhere in the rear our artillery struck the tanks. The shells burst thickly. One of the enemy fighting vehicles burst into flames about 150 meters from the firing line. There was a hope. Maybe the others would not reach. But no. Tank stubbornly crawled to the firing position of the company. Here the front one had already equaled the burnt briar bush and crushed it under itself. The hull of the machine, turned strictly on the trench, instantly grew to a huge size. "I'll take this one." Mikhail pulled the anti-tank grenade closer to him, and swinging around, threw it. He didn't feel the explosion, obviously because everything around him rumbled, and when he looked out a few seconds later, he saw a ribbon of caterpillar tracks behind the tank. The multi-ton hulk leaned to the right, its turret still rotating slowly. Someone had thrown a grenade into the stern. The explosion blew away the armor protection, flames erupted. The turret hatch opened. A German tanker appeared and the soldiers immediately hit him with carbines and rifles. The German fell inside the steel box. 50 meters to the right, another tank managed to jump the trench, turn over the trench and flatten a mortar. A fighter rushed toward the enemy vehicle. In a few jumps, he caught up with the tank and threw a bunch of grenades into its stern and slipped into a nearby crater. An explosion sounded, and the steel machine was covered with smoke. Another tank was approaching the line of defense of the mortars, and 40 meters behind it, the German infantry was running. Regression, tearing his voice, shouted, "Infantry, infantry cut off." As if in response to his call, shots slammed from the neighboring cells. A machine gun burst. The bullets fell several men among the attackers, but did not stop the chain. Up to a company, the officer estimated the size of the enemy. "And here comes this one." He glanced again at the tank and saw the earth thrown out by the explosion rise up from under it. The machine began to topple sideways. The German chain thinned. But the bulk of Hitlerites, having broken through the barrier of explosions, rushed to the cells and trenches. And when it seemed to them that the victory is close, from the flank suddenly broke out a friendly Russian hurrah. The Germans somehow immediately recoiled, and then ran back. Mortars pursued the enemy. Regression saw not far from himself Company Commander Lieutenant Ponomarev. "No, Comrade Lieutenant, are you?" joyfully exclaimed Regression. "Aye, aye," surprised. "I saw that the Germans are surrounding you here, and I hurried with the NP here. And as you see, I got here in time." An hour and a half later, when I arrived at the mortar firing position, the company had already managed to bury those who had fallen in the battle and send the seriously wounded to the rear. Here, Lieutenant Vasily Ponomarev told me about the details of the past battle. We walked along the firing position, smelled of cinders, hot iron. Blackened hulks of fascist tanks stood on the line of battle. Newly formed mortar crews were tidying up trenches and trenches. Many fighters had visible bandages. Some were fresh. Others had already blackened from soot, dust, and sweat. 3 mortars remained intact. They were already standing in the trenches, ready to open fire. Nearby, in the trenches, were boxes of mines, just brought from the regimental ammunition station, explained Ponomarev. "Now we live." Lieutenant Regression came up. He and the mortar commanders checked the sights. Mikhail Filipovich unbuttoned a pocket of his uniform, took out a package neatly wrapped in a sheet of student's notebook and handed it to me. "Party and Komsomol tickets of the dead guys, Comrade Captain. I collected them here on duty as a member of the party bureau of the regiment. Please give them to the deputy commander." Regression's lips trembled nervously. His voice broke at the last words. I stepped to him and silently hugged him tightly. The company, although pretty battered but alive, and therefore able to fight, there were urgent matters waiting at the NP. Captain Presniakov a few minutes ago reported the Germans are accumulating in Sisha for a new attack, wishing everyone success. Turned to Lieutenant Ponomarev. "Vasily Dmitrievich, distinguished present to the awards. Do not forget to note the fallen. They are worthy of our highest respect." The NP met Captain Presniakov. Reported the situation. The enemy continuing to storm the positions of the 828th and 862nd Rifle Regiments, preparing to strike in our direction. Igor Tarasovich reported. "Yes, Major Kulyabin called. Your former chief was mortally wounded." "Major Rumyantsev." I lost my breath. This man was very dear to me. We've recently met him here near Dorotka. Pyotr Vasilievich was familiarizing himself with the defense of the regiment. I looked into the battalion. He never ignored me, at least for a few minutes, but he would appear, ask about my mood, give me advice. And here was the bitter news. Soon I learned the details of his death. Colonel Abashev decided to move the operational group of the division closer to the battle regiments. The situation was changing rapidly, and it was necessary to make decisions on the spot. The group was headed by Major Rumyantsev. Having arrived at the headquarters of our regiment, Pyotr Vasilievich began to establish communication with the parts of the division. At that time, an artillery raid began. Several heavy shells fell near the headquarters dugout. We had to leave the room and hide in the nearby shelter. Rumyantsev and Major Kulyabin waited out the artillery attack in one crevice. After it came out to the dugout, from the direction of Sishit's rumbled tank engines. "They are coming again," sighed Kulyabin. He ran up a small hillock and looked in the direction of the settlement. "Nagy, can you see them? Nikolai Afanasyevich?" "Not yet, but they are about to come." At that time, a falling mine rustled over Kulyabin's head. He didn't even have time to duck as the explosion sounded. Something hot burned his neck. Nikolai Afanasyevich turned back. Rumyantsev, clutching his chest, was slowly sinking to the ground. "What's the matter with you, Petr? Wounded?" It seems. Kulyabin rushed to Rumyantsev and shouted, get a doctor here." Regimental medics Captain Viktor Cherny and Senior Lieutenant Stepan Berry came running. The wound was more than serious. 18 pieces of shrapnel took Major Rumyantsev. He lost consciousness, and on the way to the medical battalion died. I involuntarily imagined the tear-filled eyes of Lena, Pyotr Vasilievich's wife. Pyotr and Lena found each other on the front roads. They fell in love and got married. They were happy, although they endured a lot of inconveniences associated with constant danger, unsettled everyday life, but they somehow did not think about it. In the foreground they have not personal affairs and service concerns. Peter was an operator, Lena was a medic. I envied their love and happiness. Now the grief has fallen on Lena. I must say she bore it bravely. She buried Pyotr Vasilievich in Lvov. She remained faithful to her first love. Now Lena Kuzminichna Rumyantseva lives in Rostov-on-Don. I can't help but remember here about our other girls and women, frontline soldiers. Having taken on their shoulders the weight of the hiking life, they carried this burden equally with men. They made communications, carried the wounded, carried the guards. The officer Tamara Ivanova commanded a mortar platoon. During the battles for the bridgehead on the left bank of the Vistula River, she died a death of bravery. In critical moments of fights, girls became behind machine guns, took up automatic rifles, and together with all reflected the enemy. September 13 was a difficult situation. All those who were in the headquarters and in the rear of the regiment were thrown to the front line. The ammunition was coming to an end. Major Modin took off the posts girls and put them to bring ammunition. Knee-deep in slurry, waist-deep in water, under enemy fire, they ferried boxes of ammunition and mines across the river. With warmth, I remember medics Kozaka, Mironova, Vorobieva, Dimitrieva, and our other healers. Women in white coats, our divisional nightingale Kiryukina. Maria had a well-practiced voice. She healed the soldiers not only with the hands of a medic, but also with a cheerful song. Many girls at the front found their destiny. Nurse Katia became a friend of our mortarman Vasily Ponomarev. In the battles at the bridgehead, I felt especially keenly how infinitely dear Marina became to me. During all the days of fighting, I was only once really scared, when German tanks broke through to the command post of the regiment, not far from which there was a medical centre. Fortunately, everything turned out safely. For almost 2 more days, the fascists continued to ram our defences frantically. Bleeding battalions of the 828th and 862nd Regiments slowly faded, gradually denuding the rear of our regiment. We held back the enemy, but every hour it became more and more difficult to do so. Our bridgehead had already played its distracting role. For a month and a half of fighting, it chained to itself large forces of the enemy, helped the front troops to expand the main Sandomir bridgehead so much that later it could accommodate the whole group to strike a blow to the Nazi. On September 14, the command of the 1st Ukrainian Front, in an effort to preserve the survivors of our soldiers and commanders, gave the order to abandon the bridgehead. Major Pavyuk brought it to the officers and announced the order of withdrawal. The first to leave the left bank of the rear, the last, the rifle units. The meeting was over. We began to disperse. But Valentin Evstafievich called me. "Tune in, hold up for a minute." I approached the regiment commander. Pavlyuk sighed, looking me over, and in a slightly trembling voice, "I know your battalion suffered more than others. They were the first to enter the bridgehead and the last to leave, but nothing can be done. Other battalions have fewer men than yours. I hope you'll make it this time too. See, the boats will be waiting for you on the shore. I waved my hand tiredly. I see. If you're destined to burn, as they say in Siberia, you won't drown. An exhausted smile slid across the gaunt face of Major Pavio. Well, that's good. Let's discuss the details of the task. We left the dugout, inspected the lines of defense, ways of withdrawal. In parting, Valentin Evstafievich hugged. Now take care, Sasha, yourself, people. We still have a lot of things ahead of us. The last night was the most difficult for the battalion. Neighbours were leaving. We continued to fight off the advancing enemy. The Nazis, seeing their superiority, offered us to surrender. Otherwise, they threatened to drown us in the Vistula. The battalion repelled 6 attacks in succession. Only in the morning we managed to break away from the enemy and move back to the boats. Taking advantage of the lull, we started the crossing. These days were expensive for us. Only in the last battles gave their young lives Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Koshevnikov, Captain Isaac Blismerk, Senior Lieutenants Dmitry Odigov, Nikolay Larin, Lieutenant Peter Bystruk-Shiko, Junior Lieutenants Viktor Fedorov, Nikita Chudov, many sergeants and soldiers, Captain Konstantin Lisitsyn, Assistant Chief of Staff of the Regiment on Communications, Senior Lieutenants Anton Ilyin, Alexander Nikitin were seriously wounded. We were leaving to replenish ourselves and come back again to crush the hated enemy.